Hi, and welcome to my talk on how teachers teach, comparing classroom pedagogical practices in the Asia and Pacific region. This is joint work with Kirsty Newman, my former colleague at the Asian Development Bank. And you can see the link to the brief is available to download for free. So if you're interested in the topic of this discussion, I would recommend that you go check out our brief. So what motivated our work is that over the last 50 years, schooling has expanded dramatically in most low and middle income countries. However, hundreds of millions of children are attending school without achieving even basic learning outcomes. Needless to say that the COVID-19 pandemic will only exacerbate this learning crisis. Even high-income countries such as Australia, the UK, and the US lately have been questioning their teaching practices after seeing learning outcomes lag those in East Asian economies. So teaching practices play a significant role in fostering student motivation, learning, and achievement. This is why we want to focus on teaching practice. So let's begin by looking at learning outcomes in the Asia and Pacific. What you're looking at is our list of 18 Asia and Pacific economies. And the indicator that we are looking at is the Learning Poverty Index. The Learning Poverty Index represents the percentage of 10-year-olds who are not able to read or understand a basic text. So as you can see, there is a lot of diversity in the Asia Pacific region. You have economies such as Vietnam, Singapore, the Republic of Korea, Japan, and Hong Kong, where less than 5% of children of 10-year-olds have difficulty reading and understanding a simple text. So this is good. You want this number to be very low. It means that the level of learning poverty in these economies is very, very low. But on the other side on the other end of the spectrum, you have economies such as Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, where more than half of the 10-year-olds have problems, have difficulties reading and understanding a simple text. And then you have some economies in between where learning poverty is still high, even if it's below 50%. So this is what we call a traffic light assessment, where economies that have very low learning poverty get a green light. Economies that are below 50% but still show some high levels of learning poverty get an amber light, and economies where learning poverty is really high get a red light. The gray or silver light symbolizes the fact that no data is available for that economy. Now, to complement learning poverty, we also look at the PISA 2018 average score for reading, math, and science. So again, what this confirms is a lot of diversity in the region, with a lot of economies that achieve above average scores, and some of them are still way below average. And I think only Australia is at average or slightly below. So this is showing us that there is a great deal of diversity, but also that there are a lot of economies where learning outcomes are low. We contribute to this discussion by painting a clearer picture of teaching practice in the Asia-Pacific region using a comprehensive literature review of direct observation studies. And we compare student assessments with classroom observation studies to determine what is the most reliable way to assess teaching practices. And we focus on a sample of 18 Pacific economies that have both data on learning outcomes and also qualitative evidence of teaching practices. And it's important to notice that countries in Central and West Asia and also Pacific Island countries lack data and therefore are underrepresented in our study. What we do is that we focus on two aspects of teaching practice that have been promoted by international organizations. For economies have introduced policies that aim to embed them in their education systems. Number one, the use of interactive teaching approaches, And number two, the fostering of higher order thinking skills. Well, it is often assumed that higher order thinking skills are developed mainly through interactive teaching approaches, but actually from the very beginning of our analysis, we saw that in some contexts, practices enable students to develop and use higher order thinking skills without using a higher interactive teaching approach. So for this reason, we examined higher order thinking skills and interactive teaching separately. So let's begin with direct observation studies. We conducted a comprehensive literature review to identify studies that used classroom observation, either direct or via video recordings, for each eligible economy. So we gathered all studies using the Teach toolkit. We gathered as many studies as possible using the Class toolkit. In addition, we searched both Google and Google Scholar for additional classroom observation studies that did not use these two standardized text toolkits. Where, again, we could find only few or poor quality studies, then we went ahead and contacted academics or practitioners who are working on K-12 pedagogy in the location of interest. So we assessed studies as high rigor if they were based on a nationally or regionally representative sample, and if they are conducted by observers in a manner that sought to minimize the risk of bias in data collection. Excuse me. Studies that did not meet both criteria because they used smaller sample sizes or less transparent data gathering, bias-prone approaches, etc., were assessed as low rigor. But what is important to notice is that low rigor doesn't mean low quality. A study may provide very high quality information in a specific context, but it would still be low rigor, for example, if it's not nationally representative. This is what we find as a summary of our qualitative assessment. We see, again, so much diversity. We see that most economies in Asia-Pacific region do not have group work and interactive learning. And also that, again, there is a lot of diversity in the stimulation of higher order thinking. In particular, teacher-led approaches dominate in many economies. But there are some signs of shifts in practice as a result of significant policy drives to improve critical thinking and problem solving in countries such as the PRC, which means People's Republic of China. Teaching that mainly uses whole class approaches, but again appears to be effective at fostering higher order thinking skills, particularly in Japan and the Republic of Korea, highlights that there is not one universal approach to effective teaching. Now, moving on to student-reported practice, the question that we wanted to answer is, could student surveys be a reliable alternative source of data on teaching practices? So in order to test that, we selected 6 indicators from the PISA 2018 student questionnaires that are proxies for interactive teaching approaches. So the score for each question is given as a proportion of students from a given economy that score their teachers highly on the following. 1, asks to discuss in small groups with other students who read the same book or chapter. Asks questions to check whether students have understood what was taught. Listens to students' view on how to do things. Adapts the lesson to the needs and knowledge of the class. Provides individual help when a student has difficulties understanding a topic or task. And tells students how to improve their performance. So once we plot student perception versus the qualitative assessment of teaching practice that we conducted, we find that, as you can see, if our qualitative assessment of teaching practices aligned closely with student assessment, we would see the observations clustered along the 45-degree line. But this is not the case for any of the 6 indicators that we have selected from the PISA student questionnaires. So as you can see, the students tend to give high assessments, for example, on indicators of student-centered learning, such as discussing in small groups, But there is pretty much no alignment between these two things. So what would be the reason of that? And are student responses a better indicator of teaching practice than qualitative data? The short answer is no. Even if we focus only on economies where the qualitative data is strongest, there are still significant discrepancies with student assessments. Students in economies with relatively high power distance may be less likely to assign scores that could be interpreted as criticism of teachers. So this, for example, has been noticed in the Philippines. For these examples, please see our brief. Students may score teachers relative to their expectations. So in contexts where students expect a lot of interactive teaching, they might score it low, even if a high level of interaction in teaching is already present. Students in different contexts may also understand the question differently. So this is something that has been noticed in a study that was comparing students in Australia to students in Taipei, China. So the findings are sufficient to raise questions about the reliability of using student reports of teaching practice to compare teaching practices in different locations. So to conclude, except for New Zealand and Australia, teaching practices in the Asia Pacific region tend to use more teacher-centered whole class approaches. But we again saw that teaching approaches ranging from the most learner-centered to the most teacher-centered can be effective in developing learning outcomes. Direct observation studies show that the quality of teaching practice in developing Asia is low. And in the absence of large-scale comparative studies, qualitative information on observed teaching practice is useful for understanding what is happening in the classroom, whereas data delivered from student questionnaires may not be a reliable indicator of actual teaching practice. So the only policy recommendation that I would like to focus on here, which is very COVID-19 specific, is that faced with the learning losses from the COVID-19 pandemic, many are pinning their hopes on technology to accelerate progress on learning, but the evidence is clear. Technology alone, in the absence of good teaching, does not improve learning. So one of the most important lessons that we gained from this exercise was that investing in effective approaches to improve teaching is the key to tackling the learning crisis. Thank you so much for your attention, and looking forward to discussing more with you. Goodbye.